Okay, I think that's got everything set up. Hello, this is Ian Moulton, and we're doing the Google Hangout for HST 102. And today, most of the questions that we got this time deal mostly with Greece and Rome, especially with Rome. So we'll take a look at these in sort of chronological order. We'll start out with the ones that address the oldest course material and then move to sort of newer things. Some of the questions are very specific, and others allow us to talk about larger issues. So we'll take a look at that. First question. In the Iliad, the gods mentioned sometimes have, or in other ancient Greek texts, the gods mentioned have Roman names. For example, Minerva and Jove instead of Athena and Zeus. Why is that? That just depends on the tradition that is followed by the translator. Obviously, in Greek texts in ancient Greece, the Greeks used the Greek names. So if you read the Iliad in Greek, you're talking about Zeus and Athena and Apollo. And if you're reading a later translation of some kind, you might well find yourself talking about Jupiter and Minerva and Apollo, since Apollo is the same in both. But a lot of that just depends on what translators did. For many years in Western Europe, after the classical period, the Roman Empire, the Roman terms, the Latin terms, were much more familiar to educated people than the Greek terms. The Greek, many more educated people, if they read Latin or read ancient languages, they read Latin and not Greek. And so someone in the 12th century, for example, would refer to the Roman gods or the Greek gods using their Roman names. After about the 18th century, you start to see more awareness of Greek culture among the educated elite, and you'll get more references to the actual Greek names. And then, of course, there you get into a situation where people are looking at sort of historical accuracy and saying, well, you know, the Greeks were writing about these gods before the Romans were, so the Greek names are the real names, and the Roman names are, you know, something that comes up with later. So in present day usage, you might see the Greek names more often than the Roman ones. Certainly you hear a lot more about Athena than you do about Minerva, for example. But it's a historical thing, the way this was done. One thing to remember with this is that these gods weren't exactly identical. For example, the Romans had a god Jupiter before they came across the Greek god Zeus. But what they did was they looked at Zeus and what they heard about Zeus from the Greeks and said, oh, when they're talking about Zeus, that's Jupiter. Jupiter is the name we call that god. In other words, the powerful god that's the god of the sky. That's Jupiter. We know that. So when you say Zeus, you must be meaning Jupiter. But of course, a lot of the Greeks had never heard of Jupiter, and they were talking about Zeus. Herodotus, in his Greek histories, often says things like, well, we call the goddess Athena, we call the goddess Aphrodite, the goddess of love. We call her Aphrodite, but the Persians call her this, and the Arabs call her that. And there's this assumption that you can see there that everybody has the same gods. They just refer to them by different names in their language. Whereas a modern anthropologist or someone who is a religious historian would say, no, 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 these aren't exactly the same gods. One god of love is being worshipped in one place and another one in another place. But what happens when the cultures come in contact with each other is they tend to assume that the gods are the same. And this is really fundamental, I think, to polytheism, the idea that there are many, many gods. And it wouldn't have confused a Roman at all to think that, well, you know, the Greeks have a different name for such a god. That the god obviously exists, and the Greeks are aware of it too, but they have a different name. Monotheism, it's a bit different, because in monotheism, if you assume there is only one god, then God is God, and that's the only God there is that's God. And if you believe that God is the God described in the Bible, in the Old and New Testaments, then if you come across a Buddhist, you may say, well, this person doesn't understand. They're believing something that doesn't exist, because the God that I know of is the God that I understand from the my readings of the Bible, and that God is God, and that's the only God there is, so everyone else must be wrong. Whereas the polytheistic approach is to assume, oh yeah, you're aware of the God that I'm aware of, you just have a weird name for it, or a name that's not familiar to me. Another question about names came up, the idea that you'll read in Roman histories that Caesar gave corn to his troops, and people will sort of scratch their heads and say, how can he have given corn to their troops? He hadn't discovered the Americas. Corn is native to Central and South America and is cultivated in North America, and it's an American Western Hemisphere plant that the Romans knew nothing of, just as they had no no potatoes. So how could Caesar have given corn to his troops? And the answer for this is that corn is a very old English word that simply means grain. In fact, in older texts, if someone's talking about corn, they're almost always talking about wheat. And this usage persists in England up into the 19th and 20th centuries. In 19th century London, in 19th century England, there was a big dispute over tariffs on grain. And those regulations were called the Corn Laws, and there were actually riots about the Corn Laws. Well, no one was eating corn on the cob. They were talking about wheat and other kinds of grains, and corn was just a generic term used by British writers and British people to refer to any kind of grain. They would call what North Americans call corn, they would call it maize or Indian corn. And it wasn't very common outside of the Americas before the 20th century. So if you're looking at older translations of Caesar's Gallic Wars or of some other text, you'll see that corn is called corn, when really the proper translation would be closer to something like wheat or barley or grain. And so there are these linguistic confusions. There are a few other interesting ones that sort of tangentially touch our course. One of my favorites is turkey, the bird turkey, and we're coming up on Thanksgiving here in America in a few weeks, and so we're thinking about turkeys. Well, why is turkey called turkey? Or from the point of view of North American children, why is there a country in the Middle East called after a bird that we eat on Thanksgiving? Why is there a country called Turkey? And the answer is Turkey is the name of the country of the Turks. And when originally English explored to the New World in the Americas and they saw these large birds running around, they seemed very exotic, and so they called them turkey fowl. In other words, the kind of bird you'd find somewhere far, far away from your home in Europe. In French, the word is dinde, which I learned quite young when I was learning French and never really thought about it much. But of course, dinde and is the French word for India. So the French called it the bird from India, dinde. In both cases, they were wrong. It's not from India and it's not from Turkey. It's from the Americas. But as we know, Europeans called the people that they met in the Americas Indians, which led to all sorts of confusion because, of course, they were nowhere near India, though the name has stuck. So words and the words that are used often start with misconceptions or can leave misconceptions behind. And it's always good to sort of track these things because you learn a lot about history from looking at the history of words, the way that people talk about things. Next question is one that really interested me when I got it because it made me think for a minute or two, wait a minute, how does this work? And it's, why is it that citizens in Greece and Rome seem to have much longer life expectancy than those in Egypt? And I know sometimes when I've taught this course before, I've had people say, wait a minute. You're saying that Egyptians died at age 29? Oh, no, that can't be right. That must be a typo. That must be a misprint. And in fact, that's the best evidence that we have. Is that Egyptian peasants, the life expectancy of an Egyptian peasant was age 29. Well, what do we mean when we say life expectancy? This is one of these things that can get very complicated very quickly. First of all, life expectancy means how long you're expected to live the moment you were born. And that in most early societies before the 19th or 20th century with modern medicine, that is a very misleading number in a lot of ways because the main question in traditional societies with traditional medicine is not how long will you live when you were born, it's will you survive childhood? And the answer for between a third to a half of children in most traditional societies is no, you won't. You will die in infancy, you will die before you're 5, or you will die before you're 10. If you make it to age 10 and you're healthy, which in a traditional society without modern medicine tends to be about between 50 and 70% of the population, depending. If you make it to age 10, then you have an expectancy of living a certain number of years beyond that. But that's not what life expectancy tells us. What life expectancy does is it averages out all the people in a society, or it tries to with the data we have. And a certain number of them die very, very young, and a certain number of them live a lot longer. So when we say that an Egyptian peasant had a life expectancy of 29, that didn't mean that at age 28 and a half, Egyptian peasants started to get sick and died. It meant that that was the average that everybody would live, taking into account the young children that passed away of diseases, etc., and people who lived into fairly old age. So what we have for Rome, actually, the figures, I looked into this because I was interested in the question. I wanted to see what was the life expectancy in Greece and Rome, and it was basically the same as in Egypt. People would live to an average of age 29. Now, if they lived to age 10 in Greece and Rome, they would probably live into their late 40s. So if you were a peasant or a centurion or an ordinary Roman person, a housewife, if you would make it out of childhood, you could easily live to see your 50th birthday. That wouldn't be a strange thing. People living longer than that would perhaps have been. But of course, this all gets skewed too because of the evidence that we have. Our data on this is not very good, obviously, because we don't have anything like comprehensive statistical evidence for Roman or Greek or Egyptian populations. We can judge things by skeletal remains and things like that. And even those things are evidence that are mostly available to modern archaeology. What people have gone by for centuries with this material is written records. And written records tend to come from elites in the classical world. If you had the leisure to learn to read, that meant you were either very rich or very smart or very lucky. Not very many people did this. You probably almost always had to be male as well. I mean, there were women who could read, but literacy was very sort of gender biased towards men. Boys were taught to read much more often than girls were. And surviving texts are almost entirely written by men for one reason or another. So what do we have when we have records of people like Cicero, et cetera, et cetera? These are people who live a lot longer than ordinary people because they're living lives of much more comfort. They eat better food. They have better opportunities to balance their health with their life. In other words, they aren't being worked to death at some difficult labor like farming in the Nile Delta or doing construction work in ancient Rome. There are people who are able to get a certain amount of exercise but are not being sort of forced to work themselves to death. They're well fed. And something else we need to take account of, they are usually wealthy enough to leave town when there's a plague or an epidemic disease. If Rome has got malaria going through it in the summer, Cicero goes to his villa. And people are dying like flies in the streets of Rome right around Cicero's house. But Cicero isn't there. Cicero goes away for the hot season when the diseases are rampant, and he goes to his one of his villas, and he spends his time in the country eating well and breathing clean air and staying far away from sick people. And then he comes back when the epidemic is over. And if you can do that every time there's an epidemic, your chances of living into your 60s and 70s are a lot better. We have some cases of people in ancient Rome that we have no reason to doubt the accuracy of these accounts, people who live into their 80s and even 90s. But these are rare individuals. They're inevitably elite individuals, and that's how we know about them. But it gives a misleading idea of what ordinary people's lives were like. Another good question about early Rome. What was it that led the Romans to be able to sort of expand and sort of break out of the conflicts in central Italy? You know, they're a small town in central Italy. How do they manage to defeat the other towns, defeat not just Latin tribes living around Rome, but also the Etruscans, who have a powerful civilization, a very dynamic civilization to the north of Rome in what is now Tuscany? The word Tuscan comes from Etruscan. How is it that Rome is successful? What are the ingredients of Roman success? And historians have thought a lot about this, obviously. You'd like to find out how it is that one small town manages to get itself in a position where it can rule the whole world. There are all sorts of different ways of answering this question. I'll just throw a few things out. One is the Romans succeeded because the Romans succeeded. In other words, we're talking about the Romans because they happened to succeed. And you can argue that somebody must have, one group was bound to come out on top. It just happened to be the Romans. That's not a very satisfying answer. We'd like to think there's more to it than that. Though good luck had an awful lot to do with Roman success. I mean, if they had lost a particular battle, for example, or if they had lost a particular war, especially in the early days, things could have gone very, very differently. And so there's a certain amount of luck in this. The other thing, of course, is it's not predetermined that any one city is going to become dominant. You could just not have had a universal empire in Europe and the Mediterranean. So what was it that allowed the Romans to achieve that? Well, there are a lot of different factors. The Romans would have told you, if you look at what Romans thought was the secret of their success, was that they were loved by the gods because they were virtuous people who were tough and hardworking and hard fighting and clean living, and devoted themselves to duty and always worked together for the success of the republic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there may be some truth to that, but that's also the kind of stories that winners like to tell about themselves. People who do well in life tend to look and say, well, of course I'm doing well because I did all the right things. I lived right. I acted properly. God loves me, perhaps, maybe part of that mix. And the Romans had that general sense about themselves. Hard to say. Hard to say if God loved the Romans more than he or she or they loved other people. But one of the things that's clear is you can look at what the Romans did that other people didn't do. And one example here is the Athenian Empire in Greece. The Athenians were obviously a very talented people. They invented pretty much Western philosophy, drama. A lot of Greek architecture has strong roots in Athens. Very dynamic trading society, lots of outreach to other parts of the world. Militarily, very successful, strong sense of civic identity. They invented democracy, which helped them come to consensus about things. They couldn't be taken over for most of their history by one sort of crazy person who would do things to wreck the country. But the Athenian Empire didn't last very long. We don't really talk much about an Athenian Empire because it didn't last very long. And that's partly because when the Athenians became powerful in the 5th century BC, they still kept a very strict limit on Athenian citizenship. Basically, if you wanted to be an Athenian, you didn't have much chance to do anything unless you happened to be born Athenian. And to be born Athenian, you had to have an Athenian mother and an Athenian father. You couldn't have an Athenian father who married a Spartan slave girl and that the father gave you citizenship, or it didn't work as it does in Judaism, that your citizenship and your identity follows your mother. In Athens, it had to be father and mother. That creates a very high barrier to growth of your country because you've got a limited pool of people who can have children, and the only way you can expand the number of people who are citizens is to have more kids, for the same number of people to have more children. And one of the things that often comes up in human history is the more financially successful people are, the less kids they happen to have. Because in farming communities, having more children means that your life is easier on the farm. You have more people to do the necessary work, whereas elite groups tend to have fewer children because they have money and they can give more money to fewer children, and each child will be richer. If you have a fortune to divide 2 ways, it's much easier than dividing it 15 ways. Whereas if you have 2 people to help you on the farm, you won't be nearly as well off as someone who has 15 people to help them on the farm. But you can see that having the citizenship limits to father and mother being citizens, that's going to restrict things. What that meant was that when the Athenians conquered or dominated other territories, the people in those territories never became Athenian. There was no chance for them to become Athenian. Even if they moved to Athens and got involved as much as they could in the life of the city, they couldn't become Athenian in most cases. So what you get in that sense is you have an elite group, the citizens of Athens, ruling over all these other people that they've conquered. There's going to be a lot of resentment there. There's going to be a lot of people in that group that think, well, this is not very good living under the Athenians. I don't like the Athenians, or I like the Athenians, but I would prefer to live under someone else. If I can't be independent, I'm not sure I want to be Athenian. And what that means is when you get in wars, as Athens did, you can't rely on your allies. You can't rely on the conquered peoples that you've subjugated because they resent and you're not giving them enough. The Romans did the exact opposite from a fairly early date. When the Romans conquered another town, they would subjugate it and they would impose their rule and they would take the money out of it and they would kill the powerful people there and put Romans in their place and all the kinds of things that states and cities do when they take over other states and cities. But what eventually would happen, and what definitely happened as Roman expansion really took off after about the 1st century BC, is after a while, 50 years or maybe even less in some cases, the people who were conquered would start to get rights back. They would be given various rights if they did certain things, if they paid their taxes, if they sent conscripts to the Roman army and various things. And after a while, they would even be able to be included as citizens of Rome, even though they had never seen the city of Rome. They had never lived in the city of Rome, and their ancestors had fought the Romans. They would still be called Romans. And at a certain point, all citizens of Italy, whatever town you are in Italy, you're considered a Roman. At a later point in the empire, all the citizens of the empire are considered Romans. So you may be living in what is now Spain, and your ethnicity may go back to Iberian tribes, and you may never have journeyed outside your town, but as far as you're concerned, in the 3rd century AD, you are a Roman. And that means that the Romans have a much larger tax base they can draw on, which was their main reason for expanding citizenship. It wasn't so much that they loved everybody and wanted everybody to be part of one big happy family. What they wanted was for everyone to pay citizen-grade taxes. And to pay citizen-level taxes, you had to get citizen-level rights in return and responsibilities. So there's nothing particularly altruistic about this, but it worked very well for the Romans, because what it meant was the more they grew, the more they grew. And they didn't have large groups of subject peoples living under them who resented their rule and could be turned by outside forces. So that was one of the things that allowed the Romans to, once they were lucky or skilled in their military conquest, that was one of the things that allowed them to hold on to what they had and grow even larger. The other thing that I don't think we should underestimate is the Romans had very much a culture of innovation and ingenuity, especially in practical matters. And the best example of this is an anecdotal one from the wars with Carthage. Carthage, which was in North Africa, near where the city of Tunis is today in Tunisia, they were the dominant sea power in the Western Mediterranean in the early years of Roman expansion, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries BC. And the Romans at a certain point came up against them, and it was an asymmetrical fight, because the Romans had good land armies but almost no navy, and the Carthaginians had decent land armies but had superb navy. And the Romans got into a few fights with the Carthaginians at sea and didn't do particularly well, but a couple of Carthaginian ships were sunk or captured in these encounters. What the Romans did, and this is a matter of historical record, it appears in the various histories of the war, what the Romans did was they took those ships that they captured from the Carthaginians, and they said, the Carthaginians make better ships than we do. If we're going to beat them, we need to make ships that are better than Carthaginian ships, and we need to learn how to do this. This is not part of our tradition. It's not part of our heritage. It's not something we valued before, but we need to have a really good navy now, or we're going to lose. And so what they did was they took the captured ships and they modeled their own fleet on the captured Carthaginian ships and began as soon as they could to create innovations of their own that would make them even better. Lots of societies wouldn't respond like that to enemy innovation. They would say, this is a foreign way. We don't want to, it's got nothing to do with us. They're the enemy ships. How can the enemy ships be any good? Surely we could do better on our own. The Romans had, in this case at least, the ingenuity and open-mindedness to say, these ships are better than ours. Let's just copy these ships. Why should they have all the good ships? A good ship is a good ship. It's got nothing to do with Roman or Carthaginian. We need to have good ships, and that approach, I think, is one that would very often lead to success in the world, to have that kind of open-mindedness to ways you could improve and being self-critical in that way. Obviously, the Romans weren't always like that, but we're talking about their strengths and the things that enabled them to succeed. So here's another excellent question that made me sort of think, and this is a question about the Greek city-states. Well, we had talked in week 2 about how when there was a Persian threat at the Battle of Marathon and the Battle of Salamis, and the Persians were trying to invade Greece, the Greeks all came together, even though they spent all their time fighting each other other times. But the Spartans and the Athenians and the Corinthians and the Thebans and all the rest of them all got together and organized resistance to the Persians. And of course they won. They won on land at Marathon, and they won on sea at Salamis, and Plataea again on land. And they managed to turn back the Persian invasions not once but twice, which is remarkable because Persia was a much, much larger, much, much richer, and much more militarily powerful country, powerful state than Greece, than the Greek city-states combined could be. But the Greeks came together and had the advantage of fighting on their own territory. They had some better tactics. They certainly had more motivated soldiers. Because the Persians were mostly using mercenaries that were invading other people's land for money, whereas the Greeks were defending their own people and knew that if they lost, that their cities and their families would die and be destroyed and so on. So in any case, that good for the Greeks. They united and defeated the Persians. Well, how come, and this is the good question, how come they didn't do that when the Romans came? And the answer to that is an interesting one. It basically, when the Romans came in contact with the Greeks in the 2nd century or so BC, their main focus was on the Carthaginians. They were fighting the Carthaginians in the west. And those wars were going well, but they were not a foregone conclusion. And at one point, Hannibal invaded Italy and was running around destroying things for 20 years. And so the Romans saw their big fight as being with Carthage. They didn't see their big fight as being with Greece. And they also respected Greek culture. And so when they first got involved with Greece, they were sort of like, well, you know, we don't have to fight with you. We can make a treaty with you. We can, yeah, like, let's make a treaty of alliance or whatever. And they did this, but the Greeks were fighting among themselves partly because Greece at this point was dominated by the Macedonians. Macedonia is a territory to the north of Greece that is where Alexander the Great came from. It was Greek-speaking and Greek culturally and very, but they very much considered themselves Macedonians and not Athenians, for example. And at this point, it was the successors to Alexander who were ruling in Macedon and sort of had an overlordship over most of Greece. Well, various Greek city-states started to draw the Romans in and say, hey, would the Romans help us, you know, because we're really annoyed with the king of Macedon and we'd really like your help helping us to fight the king. So the Romans kind of came in conflict eventually with the Macedonians, with the Greek city-states sort of jumping from one side to the other as their advantage went, and Rome got sucked further and further in. So the Greeks in that sense were already divided. They weren't getting behind the Macedonians to kick the Romans out. In fact, they brought the Romans in to help them get rid of the Macedonians. The problem is when you bring the Romans in, and don't do this at home, when you bring the Romans in, the Romans tend to stay and take over. And that's exactly what happened. After a while, the Romans beat the Macedonians. And by that point, they were sick of being sort of jerked around by the Greek city-states one way or another. And they just said, oh, the heck with it. Let's just have a Roman province here like everywhere else. And some of the Greeks went along with that because they had been allies of Rome. Other Greeks weren't too happy about it, but by that point, the Romans were there and they had the biggest army and the best organization, and it was all over in terms of Greek independence. Greeks did very well under the Roman Empire. They thrived culturally. The Greek language became the dominant language in the eastern part of the empire, and in fact, after the fall of the Western Empire, the Eastern Empire run from Constantinople was based in what had formerly been a Greek city, and the language of that empire was Greek, not Latin. So in some ways, the Greeks, Romans, the Romans adopted their culture, valued their skills, and eventually in the eastern part of the empire, it was even the Greek language that became the dominant one. So it's an interesting sort of story of cultural transmission there. And it's important, I think, when we look back at the classical world, not studying it in any kind of depth, but we're just thinking about it, we tend to think, oh yes, the period of Greece and Rome, Greece and Rome, Greece and Rome. And Greece and Rome, as you know from having done the works in weeks 2 and 3 of the course, are very different culturally, very different socially, very different politically, and not at all the same, but there's a long sort of interaction between the two groups and the two languages and the two cultures that's sort of mutually beneficial in a lot of ways. During the sort of high point of the Roman Empire, you know, the years following the accession of Augustus, the first 2 or 3 centuries AD, the Romans in Rome had a kind of prejudicial view of the Greeks. They saw them as being overly clever, too caught up in thinking rather than doing, often effeminate, not warlike, et cetera, et cetera. They had a range of sort of prejudices about Greeks, sort of clever cowards, et cetera, et cetera. None of this actually relates to how Greeks actually were. And of course, Greek soldiership at various times in history was superb. But the Romans had this kind of way of looking at Greeks that was prejudicial, though on the other hand, most of the Roman elite were bilingual, Greek and Latin, both of them. Apparently, when Julius Caesar was assassinated, he didn't say et tu, Brute, to Brutus when he was being murdered by Brutus, and he said, you too? Oh no. He said kai su teknon, not you, my son, or child. Which is a Greek phrase. So that's interesting if true, because it means that Julius Caesar, when he was dying, so at a moment of great crisis and physical anguish and pain, when he cried out in Greek, not Latin. So interesting to think about how the cultures merge there. Next question about the Pantheon. the Pantheon was preserved because it was a church. How did the view shift away from it being a place of worship? Well, the Pantheon is a temple in Rome, in the center of the city of Rome, and it's the one sort of building that has survived more or less intact from antiquity to the present day. It's a building that we looked at in the third week of the class. Its roof survives, really everything except some of the decoration. There was a lot of bronze decoration on the ceiling, and that survived into the 16th century when the papacy was tight for money and they took all the bronze off the Parthenon and melted it down. And it was the Pope's name at that time was Barberini, and the joke in the streets was, well, what the barbarians didn't do, the Barbarinis did. In other words, wreck the Parthenon, the Pantheon. But the Pantheon survived because it was consecrated as a church. Pantheon in Latin, well, in Greek, it's a Greek name in a Latin city. Pantheon in Greek means all the gods, and it was originally a temple dedicated to all the gods. So it was the Pantheon, all the gods. This was very often when the Christian church was expanding in the years after the 4th century, they would take pagan sites of worship and pagan monuments and turn them into churches one way or another. There's another church in Rome that is called Santa Maria sopra Minerva, which means Saint Mary above Minerva. And there was a temple of Minerva, and they tore it down and built on the site a Christian church. Well, what they did, the Pantheon was too impressive a building to tear down. So what they did was just called it a church. It used to be the church to all the pagan gods, or temple to all the pagan gods. Well, now it was a church to the one true God as far as Christians were concerned. The Pantheon is still a church. It's still a church now. I don't know how often that religious ceremonies are conducted there. Famous people are buried there. The painter Raphael is buried there. And it is a site of Christian burial. It is now today a Christian church, though most of the people that visit the Pantheon today are visiting as sightseers to see Roman architecture rather than as people who want to come to a church and pray. But it still is a consecrated space. Now, this is different than the Parthenon in Athens. The Parthenon in Athens was, again, a very impressive piece of architecture. And so when Greece became Christian, in the 4th century, they didn't tear it down. What they did instead was take a temple that had been dedicated to Athena the Virgin, and the Greek word for virgin is Parthenos. So the Temple of the Virgin became, you guessed it, a church in honor of the Virgin Mary. One virgin to another. That keeps a kind of transition. The Parthenon remained a church until Greece was conquered by the Muslims in the 15th century by the Ottoman Empire. And while it was under Ottoman rule, it was used as a mosque. It was used as various things. It was no longer a church. Once Greece gained its independence in the 1820s from the Ottoman Empire, the Parthenon in Athens was no longer made into a church. It was just kept as a sort of monument to Greek national identity and Greek history, which is what it is today. But by then, the Parthenon had largely been ruined because the Venetians blew it up in the 17th century. In the 18th century, when they were fighting the Ottomans had kept explosives there. It would seem to them a good place to keep their explosives, and the Venetians thought it would be good to blow up the Ottoman explosives, and that was where the Parthenon came to be damaged. And while we're on the subject of sort of ancient buildings, the other great example is Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, which was built to be the greatest church in the world by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. It was the largest church in the world for a long time. When the Ottomans took Constantinople in the 15th century, they turned it into a mosque. But then when the Ottoman Empire collapsed in the 20th century and a secular nation called Turkey replaced it, the Turks deconsecrated the mosque and made Hagia Sophia into a museum, which is what it is now. So in all three cases, the Pantheon, the Parthenon, and Hagia Sophia, you have these very impressive architectural buildings that have a series of sort of official roles, whether they're temples or churches or museums or national shrines or of one kind or another. And you see it change over history as rulers come and go. Oh, I like this one. Ben-Hur. Ben-Hur is one of my favorite movies of all time. The question says, I've used the chariot race scene in high school world history classes. How realistic is it? And how realistic are other aspects of Roman life portrayed in the film? And it's been a while since, I'm assuming you're talking about the 1950s Ben-Hur with Charlton Heston. There was another Ben-Hur very famously done as a silent film in the 1920s. And it's been a while since I've seen either of them, so I can't comment specifically on details about, oh, this detail is correct, that detail is correct. But one of the things that's interesting, if you look back over time, is for so long, people have tried to recreate the Greek and Roman world in plays and in paintings and in various works of art, movies. Almost always, there's as much of the period that created them there as there is actual archaeological truth of Greece and Rome. And this gets us into interesting questions about how you can revive the past. What can you do to make sort of the past come alive? Because, you know, Shakespeare wrote a play in the 16th century called Julius Caesar, where he tried to recreate the world of Julius Caesar. He used Plutarch's Life of Caesar as his main source, so he was using a Greek source written not long after, say, you know, a couple hundred years after Caesar's death. So a good historical source, one of the best we still have for the life of Caesar. And he followed it quite closely. And so Shakespeare probably thought he was doing a good job of bringing up ancient Rome. Unfortunately, at one point, he has a character ask, what time of the clock is it? Whereas, of course, the ancient Romans didn't have clocks. The Elizabethans did. If we look at the staging practices in Shakespeare's stage, usually the characters were dressed in contemporary clothes, that is 16th century clothes. So it's unclear whether Julius Caesar would have been wearing a toga in the Elizabethan production. So there's some recreation, but for us, Julius Caesar looks and sounds an awful lot like other Shakespeare plays. They're speaking Elizabethan English. They have Elizabethan references in the play in various ways. And so you've got a mix of a recreation of the ancient world and the world in which that recreation was itself created. And the same is true with movies like Ben-Hur. The 1920s Ben-Hur looks like a silent movie from the 20s. 1950s Ben-Hur looks like an epic film made at that period, kind of like Spartacus that was made a few years later. A few guidelines. Most movie recreations of Greece and Rome tend to, there's a couple things that tend to happen in an awful lot of them, and it's just sort of a presentist bias. One is everything is very clean, and Greece and Rome probably weren't very clean at all. They're also not crowded enough, probably, and they also lack color. Because our image of Greece and Rome very often, if you say to someone, Greece and Rome, what do you think of? A lot of people will think of white columns against a blue sky, you know, these ruined columns and so on. Well, the columns were all painted. And the statues were all painted. The statues had you know, colored eyes and lipstick, and their hair was painted to be the appropriate color, whether it was brown or black or blonde. And the Romans didn't live in a world of bare marble at all. They lived in a very colorful world. And so when you see these recreations where everything seems to be sort of white and marble, that's not a very good recreation. In fact, depending on when you're looking at Roman history, a lot of the marble monuments we associate with Rome were actually built after the periods we find most historically interesting. The Emperor Augustus said one of his achievements was to find a Rome made of brick and leave it a Rome made of marble, which meant he built a lot of buildings with marble columns or marble facing on them rather than just bare exposed brick. But of course, Julius Caesar lived before Augustus. So if Julius Caesar was living in Rome, it must have been, in Augustus's terms, a Rome of brick. In other words, a Rome that doesn't look like the one that we imagine. A few years ago, there was an HBO series called Rome, just called Rome, that sort of traced the history of the Roman Empire, the beginning of the Roman Empire, really. It traced it from the civil wars at the end of the Republic between Caesar and Pompey, Julius Caesar and Pompey, to the death of Antony and Cleopatra. So sort of the most exciting period, perhaps, of Roman history. And it did it through the lives of two centurions who were sort of ordinary people living in sort of less exalted conditions, but it also has a lot of historical figures in it. There's Cicero appears as a character, and Caesar and Augustus, and people that we get to know quite well in the series that we know only from a line or two. We know that Augustus had a mother, for example, but Augustus's mother in the in the miniseries has a much more active and engaged role than anything we know about historically, though that looks good to me. I mean, if you look at it, things are colorful. There's a kind of energy to it. The way that slaves are sort of omnipresent and treated as if they were objects also seems to have a certain authenticity to it. I think in a lot of ways it's following documentation on Rome, but I'm sure in 40, 50 years, that's going to look like a very early 21st century recreation of Rome in the exact same way. And it's going to look a lot like other miniseries that were made at the time, just the same way that when we look at the Ben-Hur films, they look like products of their time and place. So it's something to think about when we think about historical reenactments. How much is anachronism? And of course, we wouldn't go back to the past if we weren't trying to find out something about ourselves. And so why even make a series about Rome? Because it can say things to us about power or about family or about sexuality and various kinds of relationships that people have and so on. And if we didn't find those things interesting, we wouldn't bother telling Greek and Roman stories at all. But the fact that we're finding them interesting means that we invest them with our own concerns and our own situations and the things that we're facing in our own lives, our own society. Next question is about the Diocletian persecution of the Christians in the late 3rd century. Diocletian was one of the first emperors to systematically persecute Christians by putting out edicts against them and so on. Christians had, of course, existed in the Roman Empire from the days of Christ and started out as a sort of small sect within Judaism, but then fairly quickly split from Judaism and grew into a much, much larger sect, though not at all a majority religion until after Constantine makes Christianity the favored religion of the empire in the early 4th century. Diocletian, the question is, why did Diocletian persecute Christians? What was there that did it? Well, the main problem that Romans had with Christians was that Christians made exclusive claims about the nature of their God. What they claimed was that there was only one God, and that God had Jesus Christ as his son, and that all the other gods were false gods. That was a problem for the Roman authorities, primarily because the Roman authorities basically didn't care who you worshipped as long as you paid your taxes. But most of the early emperors, in fact, most of the emperors overall, were deified at their deaths, which means there were temples to Julius Caesar, temples to Augustus Caesar. There were temples to the current empire. Sometimes they didn't even wait until and the emperor would be worshipped. Worshipping the emperor was seen as a sign of being a good citizen. Christians, of course, refused to worship at the shrines of the emperor because the emperor, for a Christian, was not a god. Now, if you're polytheistic and you believe that divinity manifests itself in all sorts of different forms, it's not a particular stretch to see that the emperor might be one of those forms, especially if you thought the emperor was a good emperor and the emperor had ruled well and so on. And in any case, you wouldn't have any strong moral objection necessarily to worshiping every once in a while at the Temple of Augustus. It would be like paying taxes or something like that. You might not necessarily be excited to do it. But it was something that you could do that seemed a reasonable thing to do that was part of the sort of social contract. It was what you did. Christians refused to do this. Jews did too, but Jews were an older and older community than Christians, and so the empire by the time of Diocletian wasn't as concerned about the Jews. The Jews were expected to be strange and have their strange ideas about who God was. But Christians were becoming more and more a part of the fabric of Roman life, and having a large group of people who refused to do a simple civic thing like worship the emperor was upsetting to Diocletian. And we can see, I mean, in recent months, there's been a controversy over athletes refusing to stand for the national anthem at sporting events. And some people in the United States, some people get very upset about this. Some people feel that this is a real lack of patriotism. And you can see how, you know, whatever your personal take on that, you can see how it's a fact that some people find this very upsetting, and you know, this kind of basic sort of social duty is being neglected, and people get upset about that. Well, worshiping at the emperor was a much bigger deal than standing or kneeling during the singing of an anthem. So you can see how patriotic Romans, some of them would be very upset that Christians didn't do this basic thing. Weren't they good Romans? But why did Diocletian bother systematically going after them? I mean, nobody's systematically persecuting people who don't stand for the national anthem at this point. So why did Diocletian do it? Well, one of the reasons Diocletian did it was because before he came to power, there had been about a 50-year period of civil war in the Roman Empire, where the empire had almost broken up into three separate parts. And Diocletian managed to restore his rule throughout the empire, and he also brought in a new system of having sub-emperors that would report to him. There would be 4 of them, including himself, and they would rule jointly with him sort of being in charge of the other 3. And this was his chance to restore a single authority throughout the empire, and also his chance to start this new system that had never been tried before of having these sort of sub-emperors. To do all this, he evidently felt that he needed to quash any forms of dissent he could find, and for one reason or another, Christians seemed to him to be a dissenting group that needed to be brought into line with force, and so he initiated these persecutions. And this wasn't the case how it always was earlier on. There are letters between Pliny the Younger and a diplomat and the Emperor Trajan in the 2nd century, and Pliny says, there are all these Christians, and they're kind of annoying, but I don't know, what should I do with them? I'm not sure how to punish them. Should I even be punishing them? What am I supposed to do? And Trajan seems to have said, oh, just leave them alone as long as they pay their taxes. Just, don't get too upset about it. Try to minimize it. Ignore them. Maybe they'll go away, kind of thing. But Diocletian took the opposite tack, and really the persecution of Christians didn't end until about 50 years later, when the Emperor Constantine made Christianity the favored religion throughout the empire, and then Christians became favored and privileged instead of persecuted, and so the shoe was on the other foot. And then there began eventually to be persecutions of people who worshiped pagan gods and so on, as the empire became more and more Christianized in the later years. Some historians believe that our notion of the persecutions of Diocletian may be exaggerated, in that most of the evidence we have for it comes from Christian writers complaining about how rough their life is and how mean Diocletian is, which isn't to say that the persecutions didn't exist, but all the evidence we're getting is from the people who were feeling persecuted. And we know that the ancient church very much valued martyrdom and suffering, and that stories of sort of persecuted Christians who overcame their tormentors with their dignity and their faith were very popular. And so that's a place where we might need to do some disentangling of mythology from history. But there's no question that there was a persecution, and that it was for real, and that it was legal, and that edicts were put out, and that people suffered as a result. So it's only a question of the magnitude of it, not of whether it happened or not. Another question about authority in the late years of the empire. In 364, the Emperor Valentinian gave his brother Valens a part of the empire to rule. He had Valens ruling from Constantinople. And the question is, why did he do this? And the answer is, as the empire grew, and especially in the later years of the empire, the 3rd and 4th centuries, it became obvious that ruling the empire was a job for more than one person. It was hard to be one emperor and still have authority over all of this massive empire. And this had come up earlier in the 2nd century. The Emperor Hadrian had tried very hard to see all of the provinces of the empire, and he spent his whole life traveling. But I mean, even he was traveling constantly for 10 years and more to get to all of the provinces. And you think how long it would take you to get to all of the Roman provinces when you were traveling on horseback or on foot, or by sailing ship. It was a vast area and required more than one person to run it. And so what Valentinian was doing was just putting his brother in charge of part of it. He was keeping it in the family. And also it was made clear at the time that this wasn't a split, that Valens would be subordinate to his older brother Valentinian. This was the kind of arrangement, like Diocletian with his tetrarchs, that Roman emperors did increasingly often in the later years of the empire, just to be able to have some kind of control over the whole thing as pressures on the empire grew greater, and it became beyond the abilities of one person to control. Now, arguably, once you start putting people in charge of different parts of the empire, you come to the situation that you eventually do come to with Rome, is that it splits into pieces, and you have different parts of the empire being ruled more or less autonomously. But that wasn't Valentinian's idea when he put his little brother in charge of a portion of the empire. And that leads us to a much bigger question. Why did the Roman Empire fall? What was it that brought about the fall of the Roman Empire? And people have been writing about this ever since it happened, and there's no easy answer. One thing that's pretty clear from recent history, recent historical work on this, is that it wasn't a matter of sort of barbarian invasions in the way that people used to think of. People used to have this idea that, you know, the Romans were all standing behind a wall with their spears and the barbarians knocked through the wall and came running over. The Romans all ran away and the barbarian hordes flooded in and so on. And that's not really what seems to have happened. What seems to have happened is that there was a frontier region, a border region along the Rhine and Danube rivers. And on the Roman side of the wall, you had Roman law and Roman order and Roman armies. And on the barbarian side of the wall, the Germanic side of the wall, you had tribal people living there. But very often the people on both sides of the wall were related to each other. In other words, some Germans lived on the Roman side, some Germans lived on the German side. Various tribes lived in various places. And this had sort of always been this way. In some ways, the lines of the empire didn't necessarily follow tribal lines. In other words, some tribes, some of them would be Roman citizens, some not. What happens that changes the balance is you start to see more and more mercenary soldiers in the legions. In other words, instead of Romans conscripting to go to the frontiers to protect the empire, what you get is local people saying that for money, they'll be Roman soldiers for a while. And so by the 4th century, what you have is basically a Roman legion that's made up of Germanic tribal mercenaries. And so you've got German mercenaries keeping some Germans, but not all Germans out of Roman lands. Well, this is not necessarily a bad thing or an unstable thing, but what happens in the 4th and 5th centuries is you start to get pressure put on these Germanic tribes by invaders coming from Central Asia, the most famous of them being the Huns. And these are nomadic people, often coming from as far culturally and so on as Mongolia. And they're raiders, they ride horses, they live on horseback, they have no interest in settlement except to pillage settlements, kidnap people, rape people, take things, and keep riding. And what this does is it means that Germanic tribes living near the frontiers of Rome want to get inside the frontiers of Rome to protect themselves against these invading nomads. Most of the tribal peoples are agriculturalists living along the frontier. They have fields and farms and villages, and these fields and farms and villages are being attacked by the Huns. So what they do is they try to get inside the Roman borders so that they can get some more protection. When they come inside the Roman borders, they want land. They often take land from the surrounding people. Sometimes the Romans let them in. Sometimes the Romans think they shouldn't let them in. Large groups of them come in and start traveling around the empire looking for someone to pay them. What you start to get is a breakdown of order on the frontier. And what that leads to in some ways is a breakdown of taxation. And local people often welcome the breakdown of taxation. Nobody likes paying taxes. And if you own a villa not far from the frontier, hey, you don't have to pay taxes to Rome anymore. This is great. But you don't have to pay taxes to Rome because the legion has fled because of unrest among the mercenaries or whatever. Then what happens is because you're not paying taxes, there are no legions anymore. The legions are paid by citizen taxes. When there's no tax system, there's no military. When there's no military, what you have is bands of Germanic tribes people crossing the frontier at random, looking for somewhere safe to get them out of the way of the Huns. The Huns eventually go away, but the Germanic tribes keep coming into the empire, partly not because they want to wreck it, but because they want it. They want to be wealthy like the Romans. They want to live in beautiful cities like the Roman cities. But by the time they get to the cities, the Romans living in the cities have fled, the taxation system collapses, and then there are no taxes to keep the city beautiful anymore. The tribal invaders don't necessarily have the skills or organization to keep city infrastructure going. When the aqueduct breaks, and then there's no more water. And then people start to depopulate. And this is something that happens on a larger or smaller scale all across Western Europe. Beginning around the year 400 or so and going into the year 500 or so, where the process is pretty much complete and there really is no Roman authority in the West anymore. Now in the East, in the Eastern Empire, in places like what is now Greece and Turkey and the area that is now Israel, Egypt, etc., those areas don't fall. They have stronger urban infrastructure. There are more people. The armies are closer to the frontiers, and they successfully defend against encroachment. And that empire, as we'll see in week 5, becomes the Byzantine Empire and lasts for another 1,000 years. But the Western Roman Empire falls apart largely because of this sort of incursions across the frontiers, but it's a fluid frontier. It's something that the people coming in are often coming because they want to be Roman. They're not necessarily sort of, we must destroy Rome. They don't want to destroy Rome. They want to be part of it. But what they do is overload the system in various ways. So that's sort of everyone's best guess at this point as to how it is that the Roman Empire in the West collapses. Another big question. History of the Jewish People unit makes reference to the Maccabees and rebellion against their Greek overlords. Is this the account that's in the Old Testament books 1 and 2 Maccabees? How historical is the Old Testament? Well, this is a really good question, and a bigger one than we have time for in the 5 minutes we have remaining, but we will deal with it in various ways throughout the course. The Bible is a composite book. The Old Testament Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, is a composite book. It has mythological stories like the creation of the universe. It has origin stories like Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. But it also has genealogical lists, who begat who, where the tribes come from, where their genealogies are. It also has legal texts saying what you should and shouldn't eat, what you should and shouldn't wear, what the best ways to pray are, things like that. It also has historical texts. It has chronicle histories of people like David and King Solomon and so on. How accurate are these? We don't know. Very often they're the only historical record we have of a given event. The Maccabees event, we have other sources, and we can compare the biblical account in Maccabees with other accounts. We can compare it with archaeology. One of the big questions about biblical history is there's this whole story in the Old Testament of the Jews being held captive in Egypt as slaves, and Moses leads them out to the Promised Land. There is little to no archaeological evidence of this, and there is little to no textual evidence of it, apart from the very detailed account that you find in the biblical books that describe the captivity and escape. There are all sorts of questions. One way of approaching it is, well, if the Jews weren't captive in Egypt, why would they have invented that story? Who wants an origin story where your people were slaves? Surely there must have been a historical basis for this, otherwise they wouldn't have made it up. That's possible. Why does one of the greatest Jewish heroes, Moses, have an Egyptian name? Surely if they didn't have any Egyptian connection, he would have a Hebrew name rather than Moses, which is a name that is an Egyptian name. So there are all sorts of questions, but they're the same questions we have with all history of the ancient world. What are our sources? How much can we rely on them? What biases might the compilers have had? What information can be corroborated from other sources, either archaeological sources or other texts? So the main rule as a historian is know your sources. Say, well, this is the story, and here's where we get it from, and here's why I think we should believe it, and here's maybe some reasons not to believe it. And the Bible obviously offers an awful lot of historical information. The question is, what's its status, and how much of it can be backed up with evidence from other sources? And very often with ancient history, we're working like this. There are periods of the history of Greece where there's only one historical text that gives us a record of that time. What if the person got things wrong? Well, that's a problem, and it's not just a problem with biblical history. We're getting on to our last question. It's good because we only have a couple minutes left. We had an awful lot of stuff, but I hope we covered it well. The last question, there was a student who was concerned about the story of Abraham and Isaac and the sacrifice of Isaac. Student suggested that the character of Isaac is known in Muslim tradition as Ishmael, and this actually I looked into this in more depth, and it's not quite right. Ishmael was Abraham's older son. His mother was Hagar, the concubine. Isaac was the younger son. Muslim tradition honors Ishmael more than Christianity or Judaism does because he is seen in some ways as being a ancestor of the prophet. Some Arabic groups trace their ancestry back to Ishmael, and that also involves Muhammad to a certain extent. So Ishmael is a well-known figure in Islam. It is correct, as the student suggested, that Muslim tradition places the sacrifice of Isaac in Mecca, in Arabia, rather than on Temple Mount, or Christians say it happened in Calvary, which is very close to Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So the different religions locate that very important early event at various locations. Impossible to say that one is better than the other, but there are different locations given. The other concern that comes up with this is the multiplicity of names and how names change in different languages and how different languages use and it can be confusing. And one of the best examples of this is just the simple name John, which is a very common, of course, English name, and it's the name of one of the evangelists in the Bible. Well, John comes from, just to give you an example, John comes from the Hebrew Yohanan, which means gift of God, comes from Yahweh, the name of God in Hebrew tradition. But it's also in various language, Johannes in German, Johannes in Latin, Jean in French, Juan in Spanish, Giovanni in Italian, Ian in Scotland, that's me, Sean in Gaelic, Ivan in Russia and in other Slavic languages, etc., etc., etc. So all those names are the single name John. You can see how that can get confusing when we're studying transcultural stuff like we are. Names often come up in different places. That's pretty much it. We're pretty much out of time. And the last thing I'll say is we had some questions about the design project that's due at the end of the semester. The design project is very open-ended. You can pretty much do anything you want with it. It's 5% of your total grade if you're needed, and it's graded on participation rather than on merit. In other words, we don't say, oh, your design project's better than yours. We just, if you do one, you can get their 5%. And it can be anything you want. It can be a text, it can be an object, it can be a photograph, it can be a picture. It's described in detail on the syllabus what all those possibilities are. So if you take a look at the syllabus under design project, that should give you an idea. It's basically a place for you to be creative and do whatever you want as part of the course. And it's 1 o'clock. Our time is up. I hope I got to everything that everybody wanted to know about, and we'll see you again. Thanks. Bye.